General Vortis slammed his scaly fist into the command console, cracking the glass, his reptilian eyes blazing with rage as he watched his soldiers being slaughtered by the humans' exoskeleton-clad warriors. 3 cycles ago, the Draconis fleet had arrived in Earth's orbit, their sleek black ships blotting out the sun as they descended upon the blue-green planet. Vortis had expected an easy conquest, a swift subjugation of the primitive apes that called themselves the dominant species. He had broadcast his demands for immediate surrender, confident that the humans would capitulate in the face of the Draconis' overwhelming technological superiority. Instead, the humans had responded with defiance, launching a barrage of nuclear missiles that the Draconis point defense systems easily neutralized. Vortis had ordered a ground invasion, sending his troops to major cities worldwide to crush the resistance and establish Draconis rule, but the humans fought back with a ferocity and adaptability that caught the aliens off guard. The Draconis soldiers, armed with advanced weaponry and shielding, found themselves bogged down in urban warfare, their overconfidence exploited by the humans' guerrilla tactics. Now, as Vortis watched his troops falling back in disarray, he realized that he had gravely underestimated the humans' resolve and ingenuity. If he failed to crush the resistance swiftly, the Draconis Empire would face a humiliating defeat at the hands of a species they had dismissed as primitive and weak. The fate of the invasion and the pride of the Draconis race hung in the balance. The cracked command console blinked and flickered under the harsh lights of the Draconis warship's bridge. General Vortis seethed, his scales bristling with each new report of setbacks and losses. The humans had proven far more resilient than he had anticipated, and now, armed with stolen Draconis intel, they had begun striking high-value targets with devastating precision. A series of explosions rocked a munitions depot on the outskirts of a conquered city, the blast shaking the ground for miles. Surveillance feeds showed Ghost Squad exos darting through the chaos, leaving nothing but smoldering ruins in their wake. "Redeploy the 3rd Legion to reinforce our supply lines in Sectors 7 and 12, Vortis growled to his subordinates, "and get me an update on our communications network. I want those arrays back online immediately." In the Amazon rainforest, camouflaged Draconis troops marched through the dense undergrowth, their movements unnaturally precise and synchronized. Genetically engineered super soldiers, they had been bred for one purpose: to crush any resistance to the Empire's rule. Suddenly, a series of explosions ripped through the jungle, shredding trees and Draconis alike. Jason and his team emerged from the foliage, their exos painted with dizzying patterns that made them almost invisible against the backdrop of green and brown. Plasma fire lit up the gloom as the two sides clashed in a brutal firefight. "Bulldog, Wraith, flank left," Jason shouted over the comm channel. "Raven, with me, we're punching straight through to the compound." The force field shimmered and crackled as Jason and Raven placed the EMP charges. The indigenous tribesmen had led them right to the generator, avoiding patrols with their preternatural knowledge of the jungle. With a crackling whump, the field collapsed, and Ghost Squad surged forward into the breach. In his command center, Vortis slammed a fist down on the sparking console as more reports flooded in. The humans had breached the research facility. They had stolen the battle mech schematics. "Enough!" Vortis snarled. "Deploy the prototypes. Let us see how these primates fare against the might of the Draconis war machine." Miles away, the ground trembled as a massive shape rose from the smoldering ruins of the research compound. A walking battle mech, bristling with advanced weaponry. Its plasma cannons swiveled and locked onto the fleeing Ghost Squad transports. "Bulldog, are you seeing this?" Raven shouted over the comm. "I see it," Bulldog replied grimly. "Evac won't make it in time. You guys get those schematics out of here. I'll buy you some time." "Bulldog, don't—" Jason began. But Bulldog had already leapt from the transport, his exo crackling with power as he charged the battle mech head-on. Plasma fire lit up the night as Bulldog danced and wove between the mech's legs, firing his rifle into joints and weak points. A swarm of Draconis super soldiers converged on his position, their weapons spitting deadly energy. In the fleeing transports, Jason gripped his rifle tight, his face a mask of pain and grief as he watched Bulldog's life signs wink out one by one. The schematics had been secured, but the cost had been high, too high. The war raged on. The schematics were hastily uploaded to a secure server, the data packet zipping through encrypted channels to every Allied research facility on the planet. Top aerospace engineers and weapons specialists pored over the blueprints, searching for any vulnerability, any chink in the mechanical monster's armored carapace. Mugs of coffee grew cold at their elbows as they worked, the glow of their screens painting haggard faces with pale light. Dr. Valerie Sato squinted at her monitor, her fingers flying over the keyboard. The mech's power core rotated slowly on the screen, a pulsing sphere of light at the heart of the machine. She paused the simulation, zooming in on a particular section of the core's containment field. "There," she breathed, jabbing a finger at the display. "That frequency oscillating at 7.6 GHz, if we could disrupt it with a targeted EMP burst." Her colleague, Dr. Sergei Petrov, leaned in, his brow furrowed. The field would collapse, causing a cascading overload in the core. Boom. He mimed an explosion with his hands, a grim smile tugging at his lips. Sato nodded. "I'll get this to R&D. If we can engineer a charge with the right specs, we might have a shot at taking these things down." In a military hospital on the outskirts of a war-torn city, Jason gritted his teeth as the doctors worked to piece him back together. Shrapnel had shredded his legs, and a plasma bolt had nearly taken his arm off at the shoulder. But he was alive, and that was more than he could say for some of his team. A knock at the door jolted him out of his morphine-addled haze. Major General Graves stepped into the room, his face lined with fatigue and stress. "Lieutenant Jason Hawkins," he said, his voice rough with exhaustion. "Damn good to see you still breathing." Jason struggled to sit up, wincing as his wounds screamed in protest. "Sir," he croaked, his throat dry and raw. Graves waved him back down. "At ease, son, I'll keep this brief." He took a seat beside the bed, his elbows on his knees. "We've got a plan to take down those mechs, but we need your team to pull it off." Jason's heart clenched. "My team," he began, but Graves cut him off. "I know, son, I know, but you're the best we've got, and we need you now more than ever." He leaned forward, his eyes intense. "We've developed an EMP charge that can take out the mech's power cores, but it needs to be placed at specific points on their hulls. It's a suicide mission, but if it works—" Jason closed his eyes, the faces of his fallen comrades flashing behind his eyelids. Bulldog, Wraith, Raven. He owed it to them to finish this, to make their sacrifices mean something. "I'm in," he said, his voice hoarse but steady. "When do we start?" The Siberian tundra stretched out in an endless expanse of white, the horizon vanishing into a pale, washed-out sky. The cold was like a living thing, seeping into bones and numbing flesh. Jason huddled deeper into his thermal gear, his breath frosting in the air as he surveyed the battlefield. The Draconis had set up a forward operating base here, a sprawling complex of prefab structures and fortified bunkers, and at the heart of it all, 4 towering battle mechs stood sentinel, their armored hulls glinting in the weak Arctic sun. Jason's team had linked up with a Russian Spetsnaz unit and a group of elite Korean mercenaries, a ragtag alliance united by a common enemy. They crouched in the snow, their white camo blending seamlessly with the frozen landscape. "All right, listen up," Jason said, his voice low and urgent. "We've got 4 mechs to take down, and each one needs an EMP charge planted at the base of its power core. That means getting up close and personal with those walking tanks." He pointed to a holographic map of the base, the mech's positions glowing red. "Alpha Team, you're with me. We'll take the 2 on the left. Bravo Team, you've got the right. Use the buildings for cover and watch out for those super soldiers. They may be tough, but they bleed just like us." The men nodded grimly, checking their weapons and gear. Jason took a deep breath, the cold air searing his lungs. "Okay," he said. "Let's show these scaly bastards what humans are made of." They moved out, ghosts in the snow. their footsteps muffled by the howling wind. The battle erupted with a roar of plasma fire and the crump of grenades. Jason and his team sprinted for the nearest mech, zigzagging to avoid the hail of energy bolts that stitched the ground around them. They reached the mech's legs, the massive hydraulic pistons hissing and whirring as the machine lumbered forward. Jason slapped an EMP charge onto the armored hull, the magnetic clamp locking into place with a satisfying click. "One down," he panted into his comm, "moving to the next target." They repeated the process twice more, dodging plasma fire and grappling with Draconis soldiers in brutal hand-to-hand combat. But the fourth mech proved more challenging, its anti-personnel guns mowing down Jason's team with ruthless efficiency. Jason gritted his teeth, the last EMP charge clutched in his hand. He was the only one left, his comrades' bodies cooling in the snow around him. The mech loomed above him, its cannon swiveling to lock onto his position. In a flash of desperate inspiration, Jason leapt onto the mech's leg, his magnetic boots clamping onto the metal. He clambered up the hull, his muscles screaming with the effort. The mech bucked and shuddered, trying to shake him off, but he held on with grim determination. He reached the power core, the pulsing sphere of light almost blinding at this range. With a shout of defiance, he slammed the EMP charge onto the containment field, the clamp locking into place with a soft beep. Jason leapt clear, rolling to absorb the impact as he hit the ground. A heartbeat later, the EMP charges detonated, the electromagnetic pulse washing over the mechs in a crackling wave of energy. The machines staggered and shuddered, their power cores flickering and fading. And then, with a roar of tortured metal, they exploded, raining debris and shrapnel across the frozen battlefield. In his command center, Vortis watched the destruction unfold, his eyes widening in disbelief. The humans had done it. They had taken out his most powerful weapons with nothing more than courage, ingenuity, and sheer audacity. He slumped back in his chair, his mind racing. He had underestimated the humans from the start, dismissing them as primitive and weak, but they had proven him wrong at every turn, their tenacity and will to survive unbreakable in the face of overwhelming odds. Vortis clenched his fists, a flicker of doubt worming its way into his heart. For the first time he began to question the wisdom of this invasion. The humans would never submit, never surrender. They would fight to the last breath, the last drop of blood. And as he watched his forces retreat across the tundra, leaving the smoking ruins of the battle mechs behind, Vortis wondered if perhaps he had bitten off more than he could chew. The war dragged on, the months bleeding into years as the Draconis and humans clashed in a brutal struggle for survival. In his command ship orbiting Earth, General Vortis paced the bridge, his claws clicking against the metal deck. The initial confidence that had fueled the invasion had long since evaporated, replaced by a gnawing sense of unease. "General," a subordinate said, his voice trembling slightly, "the Emperor demands an update on the progress of the war." Vortis hissed, his eyes narrowing. "Tell him that we are making steady gains," he lied. "The humans are on the brink of collapse." But even as the words left his mouth, Vortis knew they were hollow. The humans had proven far more resilient than he had ever anticipated, their tenacity and ingenuity turning what should have been a swift victory into a bloody quagmire. He turned to his chief scientist, a spindly creature with pale, bulbous eyes. "Tell me, Doctor, how goes your work on the bioweapon?" The scientist bobbed his head, a thin smile stretching across his lipless mouth. "The virus is ready, General. It has been specifically tailored to target human DNA, leaving our own troops unaffected." Vortis nodded, a grim satisfaction settling in his gut. "Good. Release it in their most densely populated cities. Let us see how well they fight when they are choking on their own blood." The virus spread like wildfire, carried on the wind and the breath of the infected. In a matter of days, major cities across the globe were in chaos, hospitals overflowing with the sick and dying. The streets echoed with the wails of the grieving, the staccato bursts of gunfire as desperate survivors fought over dwindling resources. In a bunker deep beneath the Rocky Mountains, Jason Hawkins stared at the holographic map of the world, watching as the red zones of infection spread like a cancer. "We need a cure," he said, his voice hoarse with exhaustion, "and we need it yesterday." His team, a ragtag group of soldiers and scientists from a dozen different nations, nodded in grim agreement. They had been working around the clock, sifting through mountains of data and running countless simulations, but the virus remained stubbornly resistant to all conventional treatments. It was Dr. Amira Singh, a brilliant virologist from Mumbai, who finally made the breakthrough. "Look at this," she said, pointing to a series of genetic sequences on her screen. "These markers, they're present in less than 0.01% of the human population. But the individuals who have them, they're immune to the virus." Jason felt a surge of hope, tempered by a cold reality. "Great, so we just need to find a bunch of people with a super-rare genetic mutation in the middle of a global pandemic, with the Draconis breathing down our necks. No problem." But they had no choice. The fate of the human race hung in the balance, and so Jason and his team set out on a desperate mission, scouring the globe for the handful of individuals who held the key to humanity's survival. They battled through Draconis ambushes in the jungles of South America, braved the freezing winds of the Himalayas, and infiltrated heavily guarded quarantine zones in the heart of Europe. Each immune person they found was a small victory, a fragile spark of hope in the darkness. But the greatest shock came in the ruins of a research facility outside of Novosibirsk, where they found a man who had been listed as dead for over a decade. "Dad?" Jason choked out, staring at the haggard face of the man he had last seen when he was just a child. Dr. Marcus Hawkins, once a renowned geneticist, now a ghost in a hazmat suit, smiled wanly at his son. "Hello, Jason. I always knew you'd be the one to find me." In the days that followed, as they raced to develop a cure from the precious antibodies of the immune, Jason and his father slowly rebuilt the bond that had been shattered so long ago. They talked of science and war, of love and loss, of the weight of the world that now rested on their shoulders. And when the first vials of the vaccine were ready, Jason felt a flicker of hope. Maybe, just maybe, they could win this war after all. But Vortis, driven to desperation by his own mounting failures, had one final card to play. From his command ship, he watched as the massive energy cannons powered up, their barrels glowing with an eerie blue light. "Burn their cities," he snarled. "Burn them all." The first orbital strikes hit London, Moscow, and Tokyo simultaneously. The destruction was unimaginable, the loss of life staggering, and as the smoke began to clear, as the fires raged unchecked, Jason knew that time was running out. They had the cure. Now they just had to get it to the survivors, to the huddled masses sheltering in bunkers and subway tunnels, and they had to stop Vortis before he could rain more death upon the battered earth. It was a race against the clock, a final desperate gambit. But Jason Hawkins had stared death in the face 1,000 times before, and he wasn't about to back down now. Not when the fate of humanity hung in the balance. Not when there was still a chance, however slim, that they could win this war and rebuild from the ashes. Jason looked at his team, at the grim determination etched on every face. "All right," he said, hefting his rifle. "Let's go save the world." The dropship shuddered as it punched through the Draconis command ship's shields, the hull groaning under the stress. Jason gripped his rifle tight, his eyes locked on the airlock. 30 seconds to breach, the pilot's voice crackled over the comm. "Get ready to move." Beside him, his team checked their weapons, faces grim beneath their helmets. They had all lost friends, family to this war. They had all seen horrors that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. But they had never wavered, never lost sight of their mission. To end this once and for all. The airlock blew and they were moving, storming into the ship's gleaming corridors. Alarms blared and Draconis soldiers swarmed to meet them, plasma bolts filling the air. Jason and his team fought like demons, cutting a path through the enemy with ruthless efficiency. They battled through the ship's labyrinthine corridors, past snarling battle drones and heavily armed security checkpoints. The Draconis fought with the desperate ferocity of cornered animals, but Jason's team was fueled by a righteous fury that would not be denied. Finally, they reached the bridge, the doors exploding inward under a barrage of breaching charges. Jason charged through the smoke, his rifle leveled at the figure seated in the command chair. "Vortis," he shouted, his voice raw. "It's over. Call off the attack now." The Draconis general turned slowly, his eyes glittering with malice. "You think you've won, human?" he hissed. "You think your pathetic vaccine can save you?" Jason took a step forward, his finger tightening on the trigger. "We've already distributed it to most of the population. Your bioweapon is useless, and in case you hadn't noticed, we're standing on your bridge. You've lost." Vortis laughed, a harsh, grating sound. "You understand nothing. This war, this invasion, it was never about conquering your miserable little planet." He rose from his chair, his claws flexing. "The Draconis Empire is dying, human. We are besieged on all sides by an enemy far more terrible than you can imagine. The Void Reapers." Jason frowned, a flicker of doubt crossing his face. "What are you talking about?" "They are a plague, a cancer that spreads across the stars, consuming everything in their path. They have reduced our once mighty empire to a handful of worlds, and now they come for us." Vortis spread his arms, his voice rising. "But Earth, with its resources, its strategic position, could be our salvation, a bastion against the darkness. That is why we came, why we fought." Jason shook his head, a strange realization dawning. "But don't you see? This war, all this death and destruction, it's only made us weaker, divided us, when we should be standing together." He lowered his rifle, meeting Vortis's gaze. "What if we could help each other, share our strength, our knowledge, your technology, our resourcefulness? We could find a way to beat these Void Reapers together." Vortis stared at him, his expression unreadable. For a long, tense moment, the only sound was the hum of the ship's engines. Then slowly he nodded. "Perhaps you are not as foolish as I thought, human. Perhaps there is a chance, however slim." He turned to his crew, barking orders in his guttural language. The orbital bombardment, the final desperate gambit, was called off. The war, at long last, was over. In the days that followed, an uneasy truce settled over the planet. Human and Draconis, once bitter enemies, now worked side by side, sharing technology and intel, preparing for the fight to come. Jason's father, freed from his long isolation, threw himself into the work with a manic energy. He pored over the Draconis data on the Void Reapers, searching for a weakness, a way to strike back. And then the breakthrough. "They're not invaders," he said, his eyes wide with a mix of fear and wonder. "They're not even alive, not as we understand it. They're a manifestation of a flaw in the universe itself, a cancer in the fabric of reality." He turned to Jason, his face grave. "There's only one way to stop them. We have to build a weapon, a device that can rewrite the laws of physics themselves. It's the only way." The construction took months, even with the combined efforts of human and Draconis. A massive interdimensional cannon, powered by the energy of a captured singularity. It was a work of mad genius, a testament to the impossible heights that could be achieved when mortal enemies worked as one. And then, the day of reckoning. Jason stood on the bridge of the Draconis flagship, Vortis at his side as they stared out at the assembling fleets. Human and Draconis side by side, ready to face the Void Reapers in a final, desperate battle. "Never thought I'd see the day," Jason murmured, a wry smile tugging at his lips. "Fighting alongside the Draconis to save the universe itself." Vortis grunted, his eyes fixed on the viewscreen. "Life is full of surprises, human. Let us hope we live to see a few more." The battle was joined, and it was like nothing any of them had ever seen. The Void Reapers were a nightmare made real, vast, writhing abominations that twisted space and time around them. Ships were crushed, fleets scattered, as the impossible creatures bore down on the Allied forces. But they fought on with a courage and unity that would be remembered for generations. They fought for their worlds, for their species, for the very right to exist in a universe gone mad. And at the heart of the battle, the weapon, the last desperate hope. Jason's father worked feverishly at the controls, his face slick with sweat as he prepared to fire. "It's ready," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "But the targeting mechanism is fried. Someone has to stay behind to aim it manually." Jason stepped forward, his heart pounding. "Dad, no." But his father just smiled, a sad, loving smile. "It's all right, son. This is what I was meant to do, what I was always meant to do." He hugged Jason tight, whispered something in his ear. Then he was gone, a lone figure silhouetted against the raging battle. The weapon fired, a lance of pure, blinding energy that pierced the heart of the Void Reaper horde. Space itself seemed to scream, to shatter, as the laws of reality were rewritten in an instant. And then silence. The Void Reapers were gone, wiped from existence as if they had never been. The universe had been saved, but at a terrible cost. Jason found Vortis on the bridge, slumped against a console, his lifeblood pooling on the deck. The Draconis general looked up at him, a strange, peaceful smile on his face. "We did it, human," he rasped, his voice fading. "We saved them all." Jason knelt beside him, clasping his hand. "We did," he said softly. "Thanks to you, thanks to all of us." Vortis closed his eyes, his breath rattling in his chest. "Perhaps there is hope for us yet," he whispered. "Perhaps—" And with that he was gone, the last casualty of a war that had spanned galaxies. In the years that followed, as the survivors picked up the pieces and began to rebuild, Jason often thought back to that moment, to the realization that had dawned on him as he stood on the brink of annihilation. That in the face of a greater threat, even the most bitter of enemies could find common ground. That survival, in the end, depended not on division, but on unity. It was a lesson hard-learned, paid for in blood and sacrifice, but it was a lesson that would guide them as they stepped forward into an uncertain future, human and Draconis side by side. For in the vastness of the cosmos, in the face of the unknown, they had learned that they were stronger together than they could ever be apart. You have reached the end of the story. If you enjoyed this story and want to support us, please leave a like and subscribe to our channel, and for every comment that says 88, I will heart every single one of them. Thank you for your time.